The morning sun hammered down on Atlanta with brutal intensity, transforming the city into a furnace of concrete and glass. Heat waves rippled off the asphalt like spirits rising from the pavement, distorting the skyline into a shimmering mirage. It was barely 9 in the morning, but the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, and the air hung motionless, thick with humidity and the acrid smell of exhaust fumes. Lieutenant Sarah Collins wiped a bead of sweat from her temple and adjusted her sunglasses as she surveyed the checkpoint on Memorial Drive. The Atlanta Police Department had set up a routine inspection point near the intersection with Boulevard, a strategic location that funneled traffic from the southeastern neighborhoods toward downtown. Patrol cars lined both sides of the road, their light bars dark but ready, while officers in reflective vests directed vehicles into designated lanes. Sarah stood near the command vehicle, her hand resting lightly on the leash connected to her partner, K-9 Max. The Belgian Malinois sat beside her with perfect stillness, his tan and black coat gleaming in the sunlight, his dark eyes scanning the procession of vehicles with an intensity that never wavered. His ears rotated like satellite dishes, picking up sounds that human ears could never detect, while his nose processed an invisible world of information that existed beyond the realm of ordinary perception. This was supposed to be routine, a standard checkpoint operation designed to intercept narcotics flowing through the city's arteries, the kind of assignment that filled logbooks and justified budgets without producing much excitement. Sarah had participated in dozens of similar operations over the years, and most of them ended with a handful of minor arrests and a mountain of paperwork. But something felt different today. She could not identify the source of her unease, but it prickled at the back of her neck like static electricity, a warning signal that her conscious mind could not yet interpret. Max felt it too. She could tell by the subtle tension in his muscles, the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly forward as if he were preparing to spring into action at any moment. After years of working together, Sarah had learned to trust these silent communications more than any radio transmission or intelligence briefing. The line of vehicles crept forward under the watchful eyes of the officers. Most drivers submitted to the inspection with weary resignation, presenting their documents and answering questions with the mechanical responses of people who had somewhere else to be. A few displayed the nervous energy that always accompanied these encounters, the natural anxiety that came from being scrutinized by authority, but nothing that raised genuine alarm. Sarah watched a white sedan pass through without incident, followed by a delivery truck that required a more thorough inspection of its cargo manifests. Then a black Toyota Camry rolled into the inspection lane, its windows tinted just within legal limits, its exterior clean but unremarkable. The vehicle bore the distinctive placard of a rideshare service in its windshield, and the driver behind the wheel appeared to be a man in his early 40s, with thinning hair and a forgettable face. Everything about the car screamed ordinary, anonymous, invisible, which was precisely why Max surged forward with sudden explosive force, nearly ripping the leash from Sarah's grip. The K-9's body transformed from relaxed vigilance to laser-focused intensity in the span of a heartbeat. His ears flattened against his skull, and a low growl rumbled in his chest as he strained toward the Camry with a determination that Sarah had rarely witnessed in their years of partnership. She tightened her grip on the leash and planted her feet, her mind racing to process this unexpected development. Max had never exhibited a false alert in all their time together, and the violence of his reaction suggested something far more significant than the usual narcotics interdiction. This was different. This was urgent. This was dangerous. The driver of the Camry noticed the commotion, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. Through the tinted glass, Sarah could see his knuckles turning white, could see the rigid set of his shoulders as he struggled to maintain an expression of confused innocence. but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered toward the passenger side of the vehicle with the involuntary glance of someone who knew exactly what was hidden there and desperately wished it would disappear. Sarah raised her free hand and signaled to the officers manning the checkpoint. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a veteran of 15 years with a face weathered by experience, immediately recognized the gesture and moved to intercept the vehicle. 2 patrol officers flanked him, their hands hovering near their service weapons in a posture of readiness that stopped just short of drawing. The checkpoint had transformed from routine procedure to potential crisis in seconds. Max continued to pull toward the Camry, his claws scraping against the pavement, his entire body vibrating with the intensity of his alert. When Sarah gave him enough slack to approach the vehicle, he went straight for the rear passenger door, ignoring the driver completely, ignoring the trunk, ignoring every other part of the car. His paws scratched at the door with frantic purpose, leaving faint marks in the paint as he tried to communicate what his nose had already told him. Something was there, something that demanded immediate attention, something that the dog's training had prepared him to find. The driver's facade of calm finally cracked. He reached for the ignition, perhaps intending to flee, perhaps simply reacting from panic. But Sergeant Webb was already at his window, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a command that would not be disobeyed. The driver's hands returned to the steering wheel, trembling visibly now, and his face had drained of color despite the oppressive heat. Sarah approached the passenger side of the vehicle, her senses heightened to maximum alert. She could feel the weight of her service weapon against her hip, could feel the rapid pulse of her heartbeat in her temples, but her movements remained controlled and deliberate. Years of training had taught her to master her fear, to channel adrenaline into focused action rather than panic. She reached for the rear door handle and pulled. The door swung open, releasing a wave of air-conditioned coolness that carried with it a faint chemical odor, something antiseptic and vaguely organic that triggered alarm bells in her mind. The rear seat appeared empty at first glance, nothing but grey upholstery and floor mats, but Max's attention remained fixed on the space beneath the passenger seat. He thrust his nose toward that hidden cavity, whining with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Sarah crouched down and peered into the shadows beneath the seat. A black thermal bag, the kind used to transport temperature-sensitive materials, had been wedged into the space with obvious care. It was roughly the size of a small cooler, its surface slick with condensation, and it emitted that same strange chemical smell that had assaulted her nostrils when she opened the door. Her heart rate accelerated as she recognized the implications. This was not a simple drug bust. This was something else entirely. She withdrew from the vehicle and keyed her radio. "Detective Division, this is Lieutenant Collins at the Memorial Drive checkpoint. I need forensics and a hazmat assessment at my location immediately. We have an unknown biological material in a detained vehicle, requesting immediate backup and containment protocols." The radio crackled with acknowledgement, and the checkpoint transformed once again, this time from potential crisis to active crime scene. Yellow tape materialized to cordon off the area around the Camry. Officers directed traffic away from the inspection point with increased urgency. Curious onlookers gathered at the perimeter, their phones raised to capture whatever drama was unfolding. The driver was extracted from the vehicle and placed in handcuffs, his protestations of ignorance falling on deaf ears as he was led to a patrol car for transport. Sarah remained near the Camry, her eyes fixed on the thermal bag while she waited for the specialized units to arrive. Max sat beside her now, his alert having served its purpose, his body language shifting from intense focus to watchful patience. He had done his job. Now it was up to the humans to unravel what he had discovered. The forensics van arrived within 20 minutes, followed by a hazmat response vehicle that drew even more attention from the gathering crowd. Technicians in protective suits approached the Camry with cautious precision, their movements deliberate and measured as they documented the scene and prepared to extract the mysterious cargo. Sarah watched them work, her mind churning through possibilities and implications. The thermal bag suggested biological materials that required temperature control. The chemical odor suggested some kind of preservative or stabilizing agent. The driver's extreme reaction suggested he knew exactly what he was carrying and understood that its discovery meant catastrophic consequences. Detective Raymond Ortiz arrived at the scene shortly after the forensics team began their work. He was a compact man with graying temples and sharp eyes that missed nothing. A 20-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department's Major Crimes Division who had seen enough darkness to make most people lose faith in humanity. Yet somehow he maintained a sardonic optimism that Sarah had always admired, a refusal to let the horrors of his job extinguish his fundamental belief in justice. Ray. Sarah greeted him as he ducked under the crime scene tape. "Your dog has interesting taste in rideshare vehicles," Ortiz replied, his gaze sweeping across the scene with practiced efficiency. "What are we looking at here?" Unknown at this point. Thermal bag under the passenger seat, some kind of biological material inside. Max went absolutely crazy when the car pulled into the checkpoint. The driver is already in custody, but he is claiming complete ignorance. Ortiz grunted skeptically. They always do. He moved toward the Camry, where the hazmat technicians had finally extracted the thermal bag and placed it on a portable examination table. One of them was carefully unzipping the bag's outer layer, revealing an inner compartment lined with insulating material and gel ice packs. Sarah and Ortiz approached as the technician completed the extraction. Inside the bag, nestled in protective foam, were 6 glass vials containing a pale yellowish fluid. Each vial bore a handwritten label with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Sarah, but clearly signified something to the technicians, whose body language shifted perceptibly at the sight. Beside the vials, sealed in a separate plastic sleeve, was a manila folder containing several pages of documentation. The lead technician, a woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, whose credentials included advanced degrees in biochemistry and forensic science, examined the vials with obvious concern. She muttered something to her colleague, then turned to face the detectives with an expression that Sarah did not find reassuring. "Lieutenant Collins, Detective Ortiz, I cannot make a definitive identification without laboratory analysis, but based on the labeling system and the transport protocols evident here, I believe we are looking at cultured biological samples, possibly viral or bacterial cultures, possibly something more exotic. The documentation appears to reference a specific facility and shipment protocols, but I will need time to analyze it fully." Sarah felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. "What kind of facility are we talking about?" Dr. Vance hesitated, clearly reluctant to speculate, but the gravity of the situation demanded some preliminary assessment. The codes on these labels follow a format typically used by biomedical research facilities, high-security laboratories that work with dangerous pathogens. If these samples are what I suspect they might be, their presence in a civilian vehicle represents a catastrophic breach of containment protocols and potentially a serious public health threat. The words hung in the air like a pronouncement of doom. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ortiz and saw her own alarm reflected in his eyes. This had escalated far beyond a routine checkpoint discovery. They were now dealing with something that could have implications reaching far beyond Atlanta, far beyond anything she had encountered in her career. Ortiz took charge with the decisive efficiency that had made him one of the department's most respected detectives. "I want that driver in an interrogation room within the hour. Full workup on his background, employment history, known associates, everything. Get me the registration on this vehicle and trace every trip it has made in the past month. And I want a complete analysis of that documentation as soon as humanly possible." He turned to Sarah, his expression grave. "Lieutenant, your K-9 just stumbled into something that is way above our usual pay grade. I am going to need you and Max on this investigation. Your instincts, his nose, we are going to need every advantage we can get." Sarah nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Whatever this is, we will find the source. Max already showed us the first thread. Now we just have to keep pulling until the whole thing unravels." The driver's name was Kenneth Marsh, and his background appeared almost aggressively ordinary. 43 years old, divorced, no children, a former insurance adjuster who had turned to rideshare driving after losing his job during an economic downturn 2 years earlier. His criminal record was clean, his credit history unremarkable, his social media presence virtually non-existent. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a forgettable man struggling to make ends meet in an indifferent economy. But paper could lie. Sarah observed the interrogation through the one-way glass of the observation room, Max lying at her feet with his head resting on his paws. Kenneth Marsh sat at the metal table in the interrogation room, his wrists cuffed to a restraining bar, his face a mask of bewildered innocence that she did not believe for a moment. Detective Ortiz sat across from him, a manila folder open on the table between them, conducting the interview with the patient persistence of a man who had broken harder subjects than this. "I am going to ask you again, Mr. Marsh. Who hired you to transport that package?" "I told you, I do not know anything about any package. I just drive people around. Someone must have left it in my car without my knowledge." Ortiz flipped open the folder and extracted a photograph, sliding it across the table for Marsh to see. "This is a still image from a security camera at a gas station on Ponce de Leon Avenue, taken at 6:47 this morning. That is your vehicle, and that is you accepting a thermal bag from an unidentified individual. Would you like to revise your statement?" Marsh's composure cracked visibly. His eyes darted to the photograph, then to Ortiz, then to the mirrored glass behind which Sarah watched. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the interrogation room, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "I want a lawyer. That is certainly your right. But I should inform you that the contents of that bag are currently being analyzed by federal authorities. Depending on what they find, you could be looking at charges ranging from illegal transport of biological hazards to bioterrorism, the kind of charges that make lawyers very expensive and sentences very long." Marsh's face went pale. "Bioterrorism? No, you do not understand. I did not know what was in the bag. They just told me to pick it up and deliver it. They said it was medical supplies. Nothing dangerous." "Who told you that, Mr. Marsh? Who are they?" A long silence followed. Sarah watched Marsh's internal struggle play out across his features, the competing pressures of fear and self-preservation battling for dominance. Finally, something gave way, and the words began to spill out in a rush. "There is a guy, calls himself Vincent. I do not know his real name. He approached me about 6 months ago, said he had a business proposition. Easy money, he said. Just make some deliveries. Do not ask questions. The packages were always sealed, always temperature controlled. I picked them up from different locations around the city and dropped them off at other locations. Never the same place twice. How much were you paid? $500 per delivery. Cash. Sometimes more if the delivery was urgent. Marsh's voice had taken on a desperate quality, the tone of a man who realized he had waded into waters far deeper than he had imagined. I swear I did not know what was in those bags. Vincent said it was insulin, medical samples, stuff that needed to stay cold. I needed the money. My ex-wife is bleeding me dry with alimony payments, and the rideshare gig barely covers my rent. I did not ask questions because I did not want to know the answers. Ortiz leaned forward, his eyes boring into Marsh with relentless intensity. Where were you supposed to deliver today's package? Marsh hesitated, then seemed to deflate entirely, surrendering the last of his resistance. An address in Buckhead, some kind of office building. He gave me the address this morning, said to be there by noon. He recited the address, and Ortiz noted it carefully before continuing the interrogation. Sarah watched for another few minutes, then stepped out of the observation room with Max at her heels. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was still incomplete, still shrouded in shadow. A clandestine delivery network, biological materials of unknown origin and purpose, a Buckhead address that might lead to the next link in the chain. She needed more information, and she knew exactly where to start looking. The documentation recovered from the thermal bag had been transferred to the forensics laboratory for detailed analysis, but Dr. Vance had provided a preliminary summary that raised more questions than it answered. The papers appeared to be shipping manifests and handling protocols for biological samples, but the facility names and addresses had been redacted or replaced with coded designations. However, one detail had survived the obfuscation, a partial logo visible in the corner of one page, depicting a stylized double helix intertwined with what appeared to be an olive branch. Sarah photographed the logo and sent it to the department's research analysts with a request for identification. While she waited for results, she drove to the Buckhead address that Marsh had provided, Max riding in the back seat of her unmarked vehicle with his head out the window, sampling the wind for information that human senses could never perceive. The address led to a sleek office tower on Peachtree Road, all glass and steel and corporate anonymity. Sarah parked across the street and studied the building, noting the security cameras, the uniformed guard in the lobby, the steady flow of well-dressed professionals entering and exiting through the revolving doors. Whatever operation was running out of this building, it had camouflaged itself perfectly within the legitimate business community. She was still conducting her surveillance when her phone buzzed with an incoming message from the research analyst. The logo had been identified. Helix Dynamics, a biotechnology company headquartered in Atlanta with satellite facilities in 3 other states. The company specialized in genetic research and pharmaceutical development, with contracts from major healthcare corporations and notably several federal agencies. On the surface, it appeared to be a model corporate citizen, but the analyst had dug deeper. Helix Dynamics had been the subject of several regulatory inquiries over the past 5 years, all of which had been quietly resolved without public disclosure. There were rumors in industry circles of questionable research practices, of experiments that pushed ethical boundaries, of a corporate culture that prioritized results over safety. Nothing had ever been proven, nothing had ever resulted in formal charges, but the pattern was troubling. Sarah forwarded the information to Ortiz and continued her surveillance. An hour passed, then 2. The lunch crowd emerged from the building and dispersed to nearby restaurants. Delivery trucks came and went from the loading dock at the rear of the structure. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Nothing triggered the instinctive alarm that had served her so well at the checkpoint. But Max was restless. He paced in the back seat, whining softly, his nose pressed against the window as he tracked scents that drifted on the afternoon breeze. Something had captured his attention, something that his training recognized as significant, but Sarah could not identify the source. Then she saw him. A man emerged from the building's side entrance, moving with the quick, furtive steps of someone who did not want to be observed. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive, with silver-streaked hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear with the other, speaking rapidly in a voice too low to carry across the street. Max's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He lunged toward the window, barking with the same frantic urgency he had displayed at the checkpoint. His claws scraped against the glass, and his body quivered with barely contained energy. Whatever scent clung to that man, it was connected to the biological materials that had triggered this entire investigation. Sarah committed the man's face to memory and watched him climb into a black Mercedes parked in a reserved space near the building's entrance. She noted the license plate, then faced a split-second decision. Follow the Mercedes and risk losing contact with the Buckhead location, or maintain her position and risk losing the man entirely. Max made the decision for her. His barking intensified to a fever pitch, his entire being focused on the Mercedes as it pulled out of the parking space and merged into traffic. Sarah trusted her partner's judgment. She started the engine and followed. The pursuit led her through the winding streets of Buckhead, past mansions and boutiques and restaurants where a single meal cost more than a week's salary. The Mercedes driver appeared unaware of her tail, or perhaps simply unconcerned, driving with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself above suspicion. He made several turns, doubled back once through a residential neighborhood, then finally pulled into the driveway of a private estate that looked like something from a magazine spread. High walls surrounded the property, topped with security cameras and what appeared to be motion sensors. The gate opened automatically as the Mercedes approached, then closed behind it with the finality of a vault door sealing shut. Sarah parked at a discreet distance and observed the compound. This was not a location she could approach without preparation, without backup, without a much clearer understanding of what she was dealing with. But she had a license plate now, and she had a face, and she had Max's unwavering certainty that this man was connected to the biological materials discovered at the checkpoint. She called Ortiz and reported her findings. 20 minutes later, she had a name to go with the face. Dr. Harrison Cole, Chief Research Officer of Helix Dynamics, and a man with an impressive resume that included positions at several prestigious research institutions before joining the company 8 years ago. His published work focused on genetic engineering and viral vector development, cutting-edge science that straddled the line between medical breakthrough and potential catastrophe. The estate belonged to him, purchased 3 years ago for a sum that far exceeded what his corporate salary could reasonably support. Financial records, obtained through channels that Ortiz declined to specify, revealed a complex web of offshore accounts and shell corporations that suggested income streams extending well beyond his legitimate employment. Dr. Harrison Cole was not merely a scientist. He was something else entirely, something that operated in shadows while maintaining a veneer of respectability. The investigation had found its first major target. That evening, Sarah sat in Ortiz's office, reviewing the accumulated evidence while Max dozed in the corner. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture remained elusive. They had a delivery network, a biotechnology company with a questionable reputation, a wealthy scientist with unexplained income, and biological samples whose nature still awaited final analysis. What they lacked was a motive, a purpose, an understanding of what these people were trying to accomplish. The preliminary lab results arrived shortly after 7, delivered by Dr. Vance herself. She entered the office with the grim expression of someone bearing bad news and laid a folder on Ortiz's desk without ceremony. "The samples are modified viral cultures," she announced. "Specifically, they appear to be engineered variants of influenza, altered to enhance transmissibility and resistance to existing treatments. This is not natural evolution. This is deliberate design." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Someone is creating weaponized flu viruses. That is one possibility. Another is that someone is developing the viruses as part of vaccine research, creating threats in order to design defenses against them. The problem is that this kind of work requires extremely strict containment protocols, federal oversight and continuous monitoring. Transporting these samples in a rideshare vehicle represents either criminal negligence or deliberate circumvention of safety regulations. Either way, it is a felony at minimum and potentially an act of bioterrorism, depending on intent. Ortiz rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation evident in every line of his face. What about the destination? The Buckhead address? Doctor, Vance shook her head. I cannot speak to that, but I can tell you that if these samples were headed for an uncontrolled environment, the potential for accidental release would be significant. We could be looking at a localized outbreak, possibly worse depending on how these variants behave outside laboratory conditions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah looked at Max, still sleeping peacefully in the corner, and felt a surge of gratitude for his extraordinary abilities. Without his alert at the checkpoint, those samples would have reached their destination. Whatever nightmare scenario the creators of those viruses had planned, Max had disrupted it with nothing more than his training and his instincts. But the threat was not eliminated. It was merely delayed. Somewhere in Atlanta, Dr. Harrison Cole and his associates were surely aware that their delivery had been intercepted. They would adapt, change their methods, find new ways to continue whatever they were doing. Unless Sarah and her team could dismantle the entire operation before they had the chance, she stood up, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. We need to move on Cole tonight. Every hour we wait gives them time to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, disappear. We have enough for a warrant based on the financial irregularities and the connection to the intercepted materials. Ortiz considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. I will make the calls. But Sarah, this is bigger than a local operation. We are going to need federal involvement, probably FBI and CDC at minimum. That means jurisdictional complications, bureaucratic delays, potential leaks. How do we handle that? We move fast and keep the circle small. Bring in only the people we absolutely trust and do not give the feds a chance to slow us down with procedure. We can apologize for stepping on toes after we have shut this thing down. A thin smile crossed Ortiz's weathered face. I always knew there was a reason I liked working with you, Lieutenant. Let us go catch some bad guys. The raid on Cole's estate was scheduled for 2 a.m, the hour when human alertness reached its lowest ebb, and the element of surprise offered its greatest advantage. Sarah spent the intervening hours coordinating with the tactical team, reviewing building layouts obtained from county records, and ensuring that every contingency had been considered. Max remained at her side throughout, sensing the heightened tension, his own energy rising to match the approaching confrontation. The assault team assembled at a staging area 1/2 mile from Cole's property, their vehicles dark and silent in the summer night. Sarah conducted the final briefing, her voice low and steady as she outlined the entry points, the room assignments, the rules of engagement. The team consisted of 12 officers, including 4 from the K-9 unit, whose dogs would assist in clearing the building and detecting any additional biological materials. This was the largest operation Sarah had commanded in her career. And the stakes had never been higher. At precisely 2:15, the team moved out. They approached the estate from 3 directions, using the natural terrain to mask their advance. The perimeter wall presented the first obstacle, but the tactical specialists had anticipated this, deploying portable ladders that allowed silent access to the grounds beyond. Motion sensors triggered as they crossed the lawn, but by then the element of surprise no longer mattered. Speed and overwhelming force would carry the day. The front door yielded to a battering ram, its reinforced frame no match for the concentrated power of the entry team. Sarah followed the first wave into the house, Max at her heel, her weapon drawn and her senses razor-sharp. Shouts echoed through the corridors as officers announced their presence and demanded compliance. Somewhere in the depths of the house, an alarm began to wail, its piercing tone adding to the chaos. They found the first guard in the main hallway, reaching for a weapon that he never had a chance to draw. He was subdued and cuffed in seconds, his protests ignored as the team swept past him toward the interior rooms. A second guard appeared at the top of the stairs, but the sight of multiple laser sights converging on his chest convinced him to surrender without resistance. The house was larger than Sarah had expected, a maze of rooms and corridors that seemed designed to confuse intruders. She directed teams to clear each section systematically, while she and Max headed for the area most likely to contain Cole himself, the master bedroom suite on the upper floor. They found him trying to climb out a window. Dr. Harrison Cole, distinguished scientist and suspected bioterrorist, was halfway through the frame when Sarah entered the room, his expensive pajamas snagging on the windowsill as he struggled to escape. Max's bark froze him in place, the primal threat of the K-9's presence overriding whatever desperate plan had driven him to flee. "Get back inside," Sarah commanded. "Slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." Cole complied, his face a mask of outrage that could not quite conceal the fear beneath. "Do you have any idea who I am? This is an illegal invasion of my home. I will have your badge for this." Sarah ignored his bluster and signaled for the officers behind her to secure the prisoner. "Dr. Harrison Cole, you are under arrest for suspicion of illegal transport of biological hazardous materials, conspiracy to commit acts of bioterrorism, and whatever else we find when we tear this place apart. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise it." The search of the estate continued for hours, lasting well past dawn. The tactical team discovered a hidden laboratory in the basement, accessible through a concealed door in Cole's study. The facility was small but sophisticated, equipped with biological containment systems, centrifuges, incubators, and enough hazardous materials to justify every worst-case scenario that Dr. Vance had outlined. More disturbingly, they found records, not in paper form, but stored on encrypted servers that the department's technical specialists managed to access after Cole's laptop provided the necessary credentials. The files detailed years of illicit research, unauthorized experiments, and a client list that spanned multiple continents. Cole had not been working alone. He was part of a network, a shadowy consortium that traded in biological weapons, genetic modifications, and other technologies too dangerous for legitimate markets. The scope of the conspiracy exceeded anything Sarah had imagined. Cole was just one node in a web that stretched across borders, that corrupted institutions, that treated human life as a commodity to be exploited and discarded. The clients included terrorist organizations, rogue states, and private entities whose identities remained hidden behind layers of corporate obfuscation. Taking down Cole had removed one threat but revealed a dozen more. And yet, amid the overwhelming scale of what they had uncovered, Sarah found reason for hope. Max had started this with a single alert, a moment of instinct that had exposed an empire of evil. If one dog's nose could unravel such darkness, then perhaps the combined efforts of dedicated investigators could finish the job. Perhaps justice was not naive after all. The federal authorities arrived the next morning, a swarm of suits and credentials that descended on the investigation with the subtlety of a hostile takeover. FBI, CDC, Homeland Security, and agencies whose acronyms Sarah did not recognize all staked claims to various aspects of the case. Jurisdictional battles erupted in conference rooms, while press officers crafted statements designed to inform the public without causing panic. Through it all, Sarah maintained her focus on the aspects of the investigation that remained within her reach. The delivery network that Kenneth Marsh had described was still operating, its other couriers still making their rounds unaware that their organization had been compromised. She proposed a strategy to Ortiz. Rather than immediately shutting down the network, they should monitor it, trace its connections, identify every participant before moving to arrest. It was a risky approach that required coordination with the federal agencies now swarming the case, but it offered the best chance of dismantling the entire conspiracy rather than merely pruning its visible branches. The strategy won approval after lengthy negotiations that tested Sarah's patience to its limits. A joint task force was established, with representatives from each involved agency contributing resources and personnel. Sarah was appointed as the local liaison, a position that gave her access to the broader investigation while maintaining her connection to the Atlanta Police Department. Max, whose extraordinary alert had initiated the entire operation, was designated an official asset of the task force, a recognition that brought a smile to Sarah's face despite the gravity of the circumstances. Days turned into weeks. As the investigation expanded, surveillance teams tracked deliveries across the city, documenting routes and recipients, building a comprehensive map of the network's operations. Technical specialists analyzed the encrypted communications that flowed between network members, gradually decrypting messages that revealed the identities of additional conspirators. Each new piece of information led to more questions, more targets, more complexity, but the overall picture was becoming clearer. The network was not merely a delivery service for biological materials. It was a full-spectrum criminal enterprise that provided research, development, manufacturing, and distribution of biological weapons to anyone willing to pay. Cole had been the head of research, responsible for creating the modified pathogens that the organization sold. Others handled different aspects of the business: procurement of raw materials, recruitment of couriers, money laundering, client relations, security. The organization operated like a legitimate corporation, with divisions and hierarchies and performance metrics, except that its products were designed to kill. At the center of the web sat a figure known only as the Architect, a shadowy presence who appeared in communications but never revealed their true identity. The Architect issued directives, approved contracts, resolved disputes, and maintained the strategic vision that had allowed the organization to operate undetected for years. Identifying this individual became the primary objective of the task force, the key that could unlock the entire conspiracy. Sarah threw herself into the hunt with relentless determination. She reviewed thousands of pages of documentation, interviewed dozens of witnesses, coordinated operations across multiple jurisdictions. Max accompanied her everywhere, his presence a constant reminder of how this all began and why it mattered. The bond between them deepened through shared hardship, through long hours and dangerous situations, through the unspoken communication that flowed between partners who trusted each other completely. The break came unexpectedly, as breaks often do. A routine surveillance operation intercepted a delivery headed for an address in Midtown, an upscale condominium building that housed a mix of young professionals and wealthy retirees. The courier was arrested without incident and the package confiscated for analysis, but the recipient of the delivery, alerted by the courier's failure to arrive, made a mistake. She attempted to contact her handlers through channels that the task force had already compromised, revealing herself as a critical link in the organization's communication chain. Her name was Victoria Reeves, and her background was anything but ordinary. A former CIA analyst who had left the agency under mysterious circumstances a decade earlier, Reeves had subsequently built a successful career as a security consultant, advising corporations and governments on matters of information protection and threat assessment. Her client list read like a who's who of powerful entities, and her reputation in professional circles was impeccable, but beneath the polished exterior lurked something far darker. The task force obtained warrants for her communications, her financial records, her properties and vehicles. The picture that emerged was damning. Reeves had been funneling intelligence to the bioweapons network for years, using her legitimate consulting work as cover for espionage and coordination. She was not the architect, the surveillance revealed, but she was the architect's primary lieutenant, the operational commander who translated strategic directives into tactical reality. Taking her down would cripple the organization's ability to function. The operation to arrest Victoria Reeves required weeks of additional preparation. Her background in intelligence made her a formidable target, aware of surveillance techniques, evasion strategies, and the vulnerabilities of law enforcement operations. The task force assembled a team of specialists, including former intelligence officers who understood how their adversary thought, and developed a plan that accounted for every contingency they could imagine. Sarah requested a role in the operation, arguing that Max's abilities could prove decisive in an unpredictable situation. The request was initially denied, the federal authorities preferring to handle such a high-profile arrest with their own personnel. But when the operation encountered unexpected complications, Sarah's persistence was rewarded. The arrest was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, timed to coincide with Reeves's regular visit to a fitness center in Buckhead. The location offered advantages: limited exits, controlled access, security cameras that would document the encounter for subsequent legal proceedings. Teams were positioned at every potential escape route, with snipers on adjacent rooftops in case the situation escalated to armed confrontation. Sarah waited with the secondary team, positioned near the parking garage where Reeves had left her vehicle. Max sat beside her, alert and focused, his senses tuned to the frequencies of danger that human perception could not detect. The operation began smoothly. Reeves entered the fitness center at her usual time, unaware of the net closing around her. The primary team moved to intercept, their approach coordinated by radio communications that crackled in Sarah's earpiece. But something went wrong. A warning, perhaps, from a source still embedded within the surveillance apparatus, or simply the instincts of a woman who had spent her career anticipating threats and evading them. Reeves emerged from the fitness center through a service exit that the team had not adequately covered, moving with the swift purpose of someone who knew exactly what was happening and how to escape it. Sarah spotted her from across the parking garage, her figure in athletic wear, sprinting toward a secondary vehicle that the surveillance had somehow missed. She released Max without hesitation. The K-9 launched himself across the concrete expanse, a tan and black blur of speed and purpose. He closed the distance with impossible swiftness, his training guiding him toward a target that represented everything he had been prepared to confront. Reeves saw him coming and tried to reach her vehicle, but she was not fast enough. Max reached her at the door of the car, his jaws closing on her arm with precisely calibrated force, enough to stop her but not to maim. She screamed and struggled, but the dog held firm, his grip unbreakable, his eyes fixed on Sarah as she ran to complete the arrest. Victoria Reeves was handcuffed and taken into custody, her carefully constructed life collapsing around her as the evidence of her crimes was documented and catalogued. In her vehicle, agents found communications equipment, weapons, and a laptop containing files that would take months to fully analyze. But one file stood out immediately, a dossier on the architect, including a photograph and a name that sent shockwaves through the task force. The architect was not a foreign operative or a criminal mastermind risen from the underworld. The architect was someone who should have been beyond suspicion, someone whose position placed them at the very heart of the institutions meant to protect public safety. The architect was Deputy Director Marcus Webb of the Federal Regulatory Commission, the man responsible for overseeing the nation's biomedical research facilities. He had used his position to shield the network's operations, to steer investigations away from its activities, to ensure that the most dangerous criminals in the country operated with impunity under the protection of the very government meant to stop them. Sarah felt a wave of nausea as the implications became clear. The corruption extended further than anyone had imagined, reaching into the highest levels of federal authority. Taking down Webb would require extraordinary care, extraordinary evidence, extraordinary courage. A single misstep could alert him to the danger, giving him time to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, disappear into the network of resources that his position provided. But the task force had survived this long by trusting their methods and each other. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. The witnesses they had cultivated were prepared to testify. The documentation they had obtained would speak for itself in any courtroom. Webb's position protected him from casual inquiry, but it could not protect him from the truth. The arrest of Deputy Director Marcus Webb occurred 3 weeks later, executed by a team of FBI agents who had been carefully vetted to ensure that none of them had been compromised by the network's influence. It was conducted quietly, away from media attention, with the kind of precision that left no opportunity for escape or warning. Webb was taken into custody at his home in Virginia, awakened before dawn by agents who informed him of charges that would likely result in multiple life sentences. Sarah watched the arrest via secure video feed from the task force headquarters in Atlanta. Max lay at her feet, his eyes closed but his ears still alert, still monitoring the environment for threats that might never come. She felt a profound sense of completion, of justice served, of evil confronted and defeated. But she also felt exhaustion, the accumulated weight of weeks of relentless work settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. The investigation would continue for months, perhaps years, as prosecutors built their cases and defense attorneys mounted their challenges. There would be trials and appeals, plea bargains and sentencing hearings, the grinding machinery of justice working its slow but inexorable process. Sarah would testify at some of these proceedings, recounting the moment when Max first scratched at the door of that Uber, the moment when everything began to unravel for the architects of biological terror. But that was the future. For now, she allowed herself to savor the present, to appreciate the magnitude of what had been accomplished. A network that had threatened countless lives had been dismantled. Dangerous materials had been secured before they could be deployed. Corrupt officials had been exposed and removed from positions of power. None of it would have happened without a dog's extraordinary nose and the trust between partners that made everything else possible. She reached down and scratched Max behind the ears. The simple gesture of affection that they had shared countless times before. He opened his eyes and looked up at her, his tail wagging slowly, his expression conveying something that might have been satisfaction or might have been love. Perhaps for them it was the same thing. The city of Atlanta continued its eternal rhythm outside the windows of the headquarters building. Traffic flowed through streets that were marginally safer than they had been weeks ago. People went about their lives, unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe, unaware of the dedication and sacrifice that had protected them from threats they would never know existed. That was fine. That was how it should be. The purpose of protectors was to stand between the innocent and the dangers that lurked in the shadows, to fight battles that could never be acknowledged, to accept that gratitude would never come because the protected would never understand what they had been protected from. Sarah had chosen this life with full knowledge of its costs and its rewards, and she had never once regretted the choice. Max shifted position, settling his head more comfortably on her foot. His warmth was a constant presence, a reminder that she was not alone in this work, that she had a partner whose loyalty was absolute and whose abilities were extraordinary. Together they had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious. Together they would face whatever challenges came next, whatever new threats emerged from the shadows to threaten the innocent. The summer sun climbed higher over Atlanta, burning away the morning mist and illuminating a city that continued to pulse with life and possibility. Somewhere out there, the next crisis was already forming, the next villain was already plotting, the next test of courage and dedication was already taking shape. Sarah did not know when it would come or what form it would take, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the moment arrived, she and Max would be ready. The weeks following the arrests brought a different kind of challenge, one that Sarah had not anticipated. Media attention descended on the case with relentless intensity, transforming what had been a carefully controlled investigation into a public spectacle. Reporters camped outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, seeking interviews with anyone connected to the operation. News broadcasts featured dramatic recreations of the checkpoint discovery, complete with actors playing Sarah and an obviously wrong breed of dog playing Max. The attention made Sarah uncomfortable in ways she struggled to articulate. She had not pursued this career for recognition or acclaim. She had pursued it because she believed in justice and wanted to spend her life working toward it. The spotlight felt like a distortion of that purpose, a reduction of complex moral commitments to simplistic heroic narratives. She declined most interview requests and deflected attention to the broader team, emphasizing that the success of the operation depended on countless individuals working together toward a common goal. Max, at least, seemed unbothered by the attention. He had always been comfortable in his own skin, confident in his abilities, and secure in his place in the world. When camera crews approached them on the street, he regarded them with the same calm assessment he applied to every new situation, processing the information and determining that it posed no threat. His equanimity helped Sarah maintain her own, reminding her that the external noise was irrelevant to the work that mattered. The prosecutions moved forward with the ponderous deliberation of the justice system. Cole, Reeves, and Webb all faced multiple charges, with evidence so overwhelming that their defense attorneys could do little more than negotiate for reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. Each of them provided information about other network members, other operations, other aspects of the conspiracy that had not yet been uncovered. The picture that emerged was even darker than Sarah had imagined. A global enterprise that had been operating for over a decade, that had supplied biological weapons to some of the most dangerous actors in the world. The weight of that knowledge pressed on her. For every villain they had caught, how many remained free? For every operation they had disrupted, how many continued undetected? The network might be damaged, but criminal enterprises had a remarkable ability to adapt and regenerate. New leaders would emerge to replace those who had been imprisoned. New methods would be developed to evade the detection strategies that had proven so effective. The fight would never truly be over. But that was not a reason for despair. It was a reason for persistence. Sarah understood that justice was not a destination but a journey, not a state to be achieved but a process to be engaged. Every victory mattered, even if it did not represent final triumph. Every criminal brought to justice represented a small but meaningful improvement in the moral balance of the world. That was enough. That had to be enough. The task force was formally dissolved after 3 months, its mission accomplished and its members returning to their regular duties. Sarah received a commendation from the chief of police, a certificate that she accepted graciously and filed away without fanfare. More meaningful to her was the quiet respect of her colleagues, the nods and handshakes from officers who understood what she had accomplished and appreciated it without needing to make a spectacle of their appreciation. Max received a commendation as well, presented in a small ceremony that attracted more media attention than Sarah would have preferred. He accepted the honor with his usual dignity, sitting perfectly still while the chief affixed a special medallion to his collar, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd as if he were assessing them for threats rather than basking in their admiration. When the ceremony concluded, he immediately returned to his usual position at Sarah's side, ready for whatever came next. Summer faded into autumn, the oppressive heat giving way to crisp mornings and golden afternoons. Atlanta transformed itself, the trees along Peachtree Street turning brilliant shades of red and orange, the quality of light softening into something more gentle and forgiving. Sarah found herself appreciating these changes more than she had in years past, noticing details that had previously escaped her attention. The investigation had reminded her how fragile everything was, how quickly catastrophe could emerge from ordinary circumstances. That awareness made beauty more precious, made everyday moments more significant. She and Max returned to their regular duties, the checkpoint operations and patrol routes that formed the backbone of their work. It felt strange at first, almost anticlimactic, to go from hunting bioterrorists to inspecting vehicles for routine contraband. But Sarah reminded herself that this was the work that mattered most, the work that directly protected the citizens of Atlanta from the thousand small dangers that threatened them every day. The spectacular cases made headlines, but the quiet diligence of daily policing made communities safe. On a cool October morning, Sarah found herself back at a checkpoint on Memorial Drive, almost exactly where the entire saga had begun. The location had been chosen deliberately, a kind of commemoration of the moment that had launched everything that followed. Max sat beside her as he had on that blazing summer day, his attention sweeping across the line of vehicles with the same unwavering focus. The memory of Kenneth Marsh's Camry was vivid in her mind, but she pushed it aside and concentrated on the present. The past was important, but it could not be allowed to distract from the ongoing demands of the job. Every vehicle that passed through the checkpoint required assessment, every driver deserved fair treatment, every moment demanded her full attention. She would not let nostalgia compromise her effectiveness. A delivery van pulled into the inspection lane, its driver presenting documents with the weary cooperation of someone who had been through this process many times before. Sarah examined the paperwork, while Max circled the vehicle, his nose working overtime as he processed the complex bouquet of scents emanating from the cargo area. He completed his circuit without alerting, and the van was waved through to continue its journey. Another vehicle replaced it, then another, then another. The morning passed in a rhythm of inspection and release, a steady flow of humanity going about its business under the watchful eyes of those sworn to protect them. Sarah felt the satisfaction of useful work, the knowledge that her presence here mattered, that the system she served was functioning as it should. Max alerted shortly after noon. His body stiffened in the characteristic posture that Sarah knew so well, his attention focusing on a sedan that had just entered the inspection lane. The driver was a young woman with nervous eyes and a grip on the steering wheel that suggested she knew exactly what Max had detected. Sarah signaled for backup and approached the vehicle, her senses heightened, her training guiding her through the familiar protocols. The sedan contained a substantial quantity of methamphetamine, hidden in a compartment that had been professionally constructed to evade casual detection. The driver was arrested, and the drugs confiscated, another small victory in the endless war against the substances that devastated communities and destroyed lives. It was not as dramatic as uncovering a bioterrorism network, but it was important. It was the job. Sarah completed the paperwork and prepared for the next inspection. Max sat beside her, ready and alert, his extraordinary abilities dedicated to the protection of the innocent. Together, they had faced the worst that humanity could produce and had emerged victorious. Together they would continue to serve day after day, case after case, until age or circumstance brought their partnership to its inevitable end. But that end was not today. Today there was work to be done, justice to be served, a city to be protected. Sarah looked down at her partner and felt the same surge of gratitude and affection that had sustained her through the darkest moments of the investigation. Max returned her gaze with his calm, intelligent eyes, his tail wagging slowly, his posture conveying absolute readiness for whatever came next. They understood each other without words, without gestures, without any of the signals that humans relied upon to communicate. Their partnership transcended such limitations, operating on a level that combined training and instinct and something that might have been love into a bond that nothing could break. The autumn sun continued its arc across the Atlanta sky, illuminating a city that went about its business, largely unaware of the dangers that lurked within its borders. That was fine. That was how it should be. Sarah and Max stood ready to confront those dangers, to protect the innocent from threats they would never see, to maintain the thin line that separated civilization from chaos. They had proven themselves capable of meeting the greatest challenges. They would prove themselves capable again, as many times as necessary, for as long as they served together. The checkpoint continued its steady rhythm. Vehicles passing through in an endless procession, each one assessed and evaluated and released to continue its journey. Somewhere in that flow of humanity, other threats were surely concealed, other criminals were surely operating, other dangers were surely forming. Sarah did not know when the next crisis would emerge, but she knew it would come. It always did. And when it came, she and Max would be waiting.